Welcome, friends, to another edition of Global Capitalism, a bi-monthly presentation of Democracy at Work and the Left Forum. I want to thank you for coming and joining with us to go through this material. This has been a special month for us because we produced an extra Global Capitalism in honor of May Day a few days ago. This is our regular bi-monthly for May 2024. I want to also mention, before I begin, that you will see during this presentation occasional signs on your screens or something you may hear reminding you of the websites and the donations that we depend on. I just want to direct your attention this time to those because while we try to minimize the financial side of all of this, it still is there. The bills still have to be paid. And for those of you that can help in financing the work that goes into this, please know that we will enormously appreciate your doing that. May 5th was the birthday of Karl Marx, a little over 200 years ago, and we were mindful of that for the usual reasons, and those are the following. No other theory of how society works is as tabooed, as banned, as minimized as the Marxist approach. There's no support for that out of an intellectual framework. There's no support of that in terms of wanting to understand the world. The Marxian approach is one way of doing that, not the only way. No one is asking anyone to support it as though it were the only way, but to ban it, to make it difficult for Marxists to have jobs in American universities, which has been and is the case at all times in my lifetime, from the day I was born in this country to this moment. There is no justification. It just denies the American people an awareness, a theory of how the world works that would be fascinating if they were exposed to it, and that I want you to know is something I went and learned on my own because the universities I attended, Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, claiming to be bastions of civilized understanding, systematically excluded Marxist teachers, Marxist material, and so on throughout the 10 years that I spent in those institutions. I have learned enormously from the Marxian tradition. I would never deny that. It would be a kind of intellectual dishonesty. But I urge you, all of you, if you have found my presentations, or perhaps my writings, of interest, if you think I've had something to say worth thinking about, then please understand that part of the reason I'm able to do whatever valuable work I can do is because I make use of Marxist theory and Marxist writings and the entire Marxist tradition. That is an important reason for you all, I hope, to pursue some exposure to it yourself if you have not already done so. It's also a reason why I decided to devote a presentation today, right now, to offering a quick overview of how a Marxist theorist approaches the world we're living in right now, 2024. What would a Marxist critique of capitalism today look like? Okay, here we go. Marx was a critic of capitalism. You read him, you study what he wrote and what the tradition he developed wrote, because it offers a critical view of the capitalism that was emerging dominant in Marx's lifetime and has been the dominant economic system for the world ever since, roughly 200 years. So the interesting thing is, why not balance approaches to capitalism that celebrate it? And those are what we learn in school. Those are what are taught in our schools. That is what my profession, economics, is all about. celebrating capitalism. And I have no quarrel with that being done. But it needs to be balanced if you're serious as an intellectual or just as a thinker. It needs to be balanced with also considering how a critic of the system, as opposed to a celebrant, thinks about it. That's just so you have a reasonably rounded understanding. Critics, as you've noticed in your own life, see things that celebrants don't, and vice versa. And that's why we look at them both. But the problem is, here in the United States, you get 99.9% exposure to the celebration and 0.1%, if that, for the criticism. My teachers either ignored the Marxian approach to social science or dismissed it with a kind of casual wave of the hand as if it isn't worth it. Even if you believe that, here's another reason. Marx's ideas spread, once he articulated them, to every corner of the world. Every country on earth has Marxist thinkers, Marxist magazines, Marxist journals. Even the United States, where it is repressed systematically, it exists. It has meant a great deal to an enormous number of people on this planet that we live on. There are even governments, like the People's Republic of China, which are officially endorsing Marxism all the time, and have been doing so since they won their civil war in 1949. That's a long time. So even if you don't want to take it seriously for one reason, there's another, namely, it's a real part of the world you live in and that you will have to make your way in. Not to understand it, not to spend a little time learning what it has to say, is foolish and blind and strange if you think about it. I have found my education here in the United States terribly lopsided in its refusal to get anywhere near the Marxian tradition, and especially not in a systematic way. So I'm going to try to explain it now. I begin in two ways at the same time. Here's the first way. Many of you think, if I can borrow the words of Bernie Sanders, that the economy is rigged, that there's something built in to our economic system, capitalism, that produces odd outcomes. Some of us are very rich, and a huge number of us aren't. Some of us have enormous power. Many of us don't. What's going on here? Some of us go to work and make the decisions about the workplace that we give our lives to. Others of us go there and are mainly interested in getting through another day. We have no power at all. We arrive at work, we do what we're told. Our biggest interest is in the money we get at the end of the week so we can go and do something that we actually look forward to. People think the economy is rigged to get those outcomes. But what they don't seem to want to understand is that there's a whole science of how it's rigged and why it's rigged. So that if you are really upset that it's rigged, as I know many of you are, then Marxism is the most developed argument about how and why it's rigged, because it's an argument about the system. It's not going to say it's rigged because these people are bad. That's childish. Even if you believe there are these people that are bad or greedy or power hungry, you have to answer the obvious question. A, why are they that way? And B, why are they in a position to impose that way on the rest of us? The minute you ask those questions, you have to analyze the system that produces those who win in it and those who lose from it, etc. But there's a second way I can get at it. And this is to play on the part of you that is, again, a child. And by a child, I mean an infinitely curious person, having been born into the world, is looking around like all babies do to understand, who are these people? What are these lights? What is this food? What's going on? And think simply. And here we go. Every production of a good or a service that we all depend on, the clothes we're wearing, the food we're eating, the transportation we rely on, the home in which we live our lives, all the goods and services that together make up what we depend on as human beings, literally to survive, but also to grow, to laugh, to love, all of that. All of the production, think about it. Most adults spend most of their adult time, 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of the day, at work, doing work. At home, in the workplace, in the enterprise, in the larger community, it varies. But production, work, is a central activity in all societies of human beings, as far back in history as we can count. And what can we say about that? Well, we can say with Marx that human beings have arranged work, this crucial central activity of the adult population for which the youth are being taught their role as they grow into those adult life situations. We know that they have been organized differently. For example, in a slave system which has existed in different parts of the world over the millennia, including here in the United States, as we all know, in the early years of our country's history, culminating in a civil war over the question of slavery. In slavery, we organized production by having a few people be what we call masters, and the people doing the work be slaves. The slaves produce output, and then what? All of it belongs to the master. Why? Because the slave himself or herself is also a property of the master. And so everything the workers produce is the masters, who then decide whether and how much they give back to the slave so that the slave can survive and keep working. What a remarkable arrangement. We got rid of that as a human race. We don't have slavery anymore. The 13th Amendment of the United States outlaws it. We don't want it. Of course, the 13th Amendment does allow it in American prisons, but that's another story. Then there's another system called feudalism. Feudalism doesn't allow some people to own others. Completely different. Work gets done. The vast majority of people are working, but they're called serfs. And they're controlled by a tiny number of people called lords. That's a completely different system. No slavery. What the serfs produced, part of it anyway, they kept. Another part, they turned over to the lord. And then we have capitalism. And that's, Marx said, yet another way of organizing production. It's different from slavery. Nobody can own anybody. It's different from feudalism. Nobody is anybody's serf. Nobody has a subordinate relationship to a lord. The very words, lord, serf. No, in capitalism, we have a different arrangement. One group of people, employers. Another group of people, employees. And you know how they get together to undertake production? By a deal, a buying and a selling deal, a market transaction. The employer buys the ability to work from the employee. Employee can't sell himself, that would be slavery. The employee sells their ability to use brains and muscles to do work. And the employer says, that's what I want from you. I want to buy your ability to work, your labor power. I want you to come at 8 o'clock and stay until 5 and work 8 hours and take a break here and there. You know the arrangement. You're used to it because you live in that system. You're used to selling your ability to work. Would have struck a slave as bizarre. The slave couldn't sell anything because he was the property of somebody else. They didn't buy and sell. Slaves were not bought and sold in terms of their daily work. They were bought and sold as animal people. Serfs, the same thing. Serfs didn't sell their ability to work. There was no wage in slavery. There was no wage in feudalism. Wages are about our particular system. The wage system, it's often called, for that reason. But notice the similarity. Masters were a minority, small one. Lords were a minority, small one. And employers are a minority in capitalism, a small one. The vast majority of people were slaves in slavery, serfs in feudalism, and employees in capitalism. And right there is a huge inequality, which we're going to come back to. So capitalism is this particular system, not unique in the world as a particular system. Slavery was, feudalism was, old village communities were. There's a lot people working on their own as individuals, self-employed, we might call them. They don't have an employer-employee dialectic or relationship because there's only one person who's both. What can we say about this capitalism that gets us to where Marx wants us to be? Here's a way. All production looks as follows. There's a bunch of stuff produced in the past that we need to carry on production now. We need raw materials, tools, equipment, a place. I'll use an example. Suppose we are producing, wooden ladders. Well, we need timber, raw material, wood. Then we need tools and equipment, hammer, nails, saws, you name it, and a workshop where it all can take place. And then we know what? We know that in every production of every good and service, after you buy the raw materials, tools, and equipment, whoever you are, work is going to be done, labor is going to be done. You're going to transform the wood using the nails, the hammers, and the saws to produce a finished product, the wooden ladder. Whether the finished product is an ice cream cone or a wooden ladder or a software program, that's really beside the point because every one of those uses raw materials, tools, and equipment, transform them by labor into a finished product. Now, here's what you know, even though you may not have thought about it before. You know that the stuff done in the past, using my ladder example, the wood, which had to be found in the forest and cut down and processed, cut up, maybe treated with some chemical, whatever. You know that that wood, that raw material, is the product of labor. The trees don't come by themselves. Labor is involved in producing the ready-to-use pieces of wood. Labor likewise made the hammer, the saw, the nails. They're all the products of labor. And the person now, the worker now, who works on the raw material with the tools and equipment is adding more labor. That's what transforms wood into a ladder. That's what transforms pieces of paper into a finished document. That's what transforms milk and sugar and flavoring into the ice cream cone. So when you think about it, here comes the punchline. Labor is the crucial item. Labor is what makes everything. But now we come to the employer, and the employer says something marvelous and magical to us. The employer says, no, wait a minute. I own the lumber. I own the tools and equipment. I bring them to the production site, to the factory, the office, the store. The worker only adds labor now. I'm the one who brings the capital, general word for all the stuff I already own if I'm the employer, because that's why I'm called a capitalist, because I own the stuff that I bring, the tools and raw materials in the factory. But Marx reacts, you didn't make those things. You may own them, but you didn't make them. It's not your labor that's congealed in those tools, equipment, and raw materials. Somehow, the labor done by the people who made the lumber and made the nails and made the hammer and made the saw, somehow that labor that made them got lost to those people. They don't own it. You do. You didn't work on it, but you own it. They did work on it, and they don't own it. Now, that's interesting. How did that happen? Because you can't be Mr. Capitalist unless somehow there's built into this system some way for the products of labor to come to be owned by people who had no role in making that product. Marx has an answer, which is one of the reasons why we need to learn from what he wrote. It's probably the single most basic understanding he offered us. Namely, it's an explanation of how and why the people who do the work end up not owning and having power to decide what to do with the fruits of the labor they've undertaken. In other words, he explains how past labor produced stuff that now belongs to people other than the laborers. Marx said that was the key question to ask, because it will give you the answer, namely how the system works, why the system works the way it does, which is on your mind a lot of the time that you're conscious, and a lot of the time you're not, in your dreams, in your imaginations. So let me do it for you and see whether you can't find something interesting to think about as I go through it. I'll do this by going back to my little ladder story, by looking again at every production process like the ladder. Raw materials have to be assembled. Tools and equipment have to be present, and then a working person, a laborer, uses the tools and equipment to transform the raw materials into a finished product. That's really what economics is about, this production of the goods and services we all depend on. A secondary part of economics discusses how those things get distributed in a society. So first something has to be produced, and then it gets distributed. But ironically, after something is distributed, it is often put into production. The capitalist buys the tools, equipment, and raw materials and puts them into production with the workers that the capitalist has hired. You're familiar with that because you're part of that. Now let's follow the logic. Very, very important. And we're going to use numbers very, very simple. Please do not be dissuaded from listening because there's a little bit of numbers here. Let's assume that the tools, equipment, and raw materials together cost 100 of anything. $100, 100 euros, 100 rupees, it doesn't matter. The capitalist in capitalism, the employer, has to have the money with which to buy the tools, equipment, and raw materials for 100. So our capitalist takes 100 and buys the tools, equipment, and raw materials. The second thing our capitalist then does is hire workers, the ones that do the work, who actually transform the raw materials using the tools and equipment into the finished product. The capitalist does not do that. It's only in rare, exceptional situations that are very small as a part of our economy, where the capitalist participates in some way in actually doing the work. Capitalists like to tell you how hard they're working, and that's very nice. But if they're working hard, it's at running all of this, not at doing the work of all of this, as most of you know. Now, let's assume that the workers during the week add value to the tools and equipment and raw materials, which is, of course, what they do. Their labor transforming the wood into a ladder adds value. The ladder isn't worth 100. That 100 is already in the ladder in terms of the tools, equipment, and raw materials used up in making the ladders. The worker who makes the ladder adds value, adds to what's in that ladder relative to what was in the tools, equipment, and raw materials. And again, to keep it simple, let's assume the worker adds 100 worth of value. So we know what the ladders will be worth. The 100 worth of tools, equipment, and raw materials used up in producing the ladder, plus the human labor right now, done to make that transformation happen. The value of the ladder is 200. 100 tools, equipment, and raw material, plus 100 value added by workers. Okay, we know what the capitalist does in our system with the ladders. The capitalist sells them. And we're going to make the simplifying assumption that the capitalist sells them for the value that's in them, 200. And now follow me. When the deal is done, when the capitalist has sold the ladders for 200, he takes 100 out of the 200 and replaces the tools, equipment, and raw materials that were used up, so he can continue to be in the ladder producing business, or whatever business he might be in. Okay, he sold the ladders for 200. He used up 100 of those to replace the tools, equipment, and raw materials. Now, what is he going to do with the other 100? Well, we know that there's one thing he has to do. He has to pay the workers he hired. Because if he doesn't, they won't come back. And if they don't, he can't produce ladders. So the only way this system works is if the employer takes a part of the 100 left after selling the ladders for 200 and using 100 to replace the tools, equipment, and raw materials. The capitalist has got that 100 left, and he's got to give some of that to the workers he hired if he's going to continue in business. Well, now, watch the bouncing ball. He could give them, and many of you, I think, imagine he might be able to give the workers the 100 he has left over. And that would be interesting, because that would mean that the workers added 100 when they worked and are now getting paid the equivalent. They're getting 100 back. They added 100 to they gave the employer 100, and the employer is giving them back 100. A fair deal, an equal relationship. The problem with that story is, what's left for the capitalist if he does that? And the answer is nothing. And Marx points out that he's never met a capitalist who undertakes a capitalist production process knowing and expecting nothing for himself out of it. That's not the way the system works. And indeed, if you talk to any capitalist today, they'll tell you they're in business to make money. They want to get more into their hands than it costs them to undertake the process. They want a profit, don't they? They're driven by profit. They seek to maximize profit. In the language of capitalism, profit is the bottom line. And Marx says, yeah, it is. And I'm going to explain to you where the profit comes from. And out of that explanation, I will teach you about capitalism in a way you have never thought about it before. So here's the explanation. The capitalist doesn't give workers the equal of what the workers added in value by their labor. To stay with my latter example, the workers added 100. What is the employer going to pay them? I'll pick something. 50. 50. The workers added 100, and they got paid 50. So where did the other 50 end up? In the hands of the employer. He's the one who sells the ladders. He gets the 200. He uses 100 to replace the tools, equipment, and raw materials. He uses 50 to pay the workers, and he keeps the other 50 for himself. That's the profit capitalists are looking for. It's what they take from the workers who produced it. Now look at what we can understand. Once you understand this, you'll understand why the employer is constantly trying to press down what he pays the workers, the wages. Why? Look at our story. The less he pays the workers, the more he keeps for himself. In my little example, I said he paid the workers 50. If he could get away by paying the workers 45, he would keep 55 instead of 50. Wow. So capitalists are always looking to, spend less on workers, lower the wage bill, economize on labor costs. They have a lot of ways of saying it, but it's all the same game. And you know how society is shaped in this way. I'll give you 3 examples from today of the United States and around the world. Capitalists are busy firing workers and replacing them with machines. And they only do it if the machine is cheaper than the worker, because then they can get away with giving less to the workers and machines than before they had to give to the workers. And that's more for them. Here's another way they do it. They move production away from where workers are high wage to where they can get away with paying low wages. That's why millions of jobs have moved in recent decades out of the United States to the People's Republic of China, or India, or Brazil, or Mexico, or wherever. There's no mystery here. If you push down the wage, there's more of the value added by your workers that you, the capitalist, the employer, get to keep. And here's another one. Immigration. Bring in people that will accept lower wages than your indigenous, native population might accept. And that'll be great for you, because you will give less of the value added by the worker in production than you had to before, leaving more for the employer. The endless effort never stops of employers to squeeze more out of this arrangement is why workers are constantly discovering that the employer is trying to nibble away at their bathroom time or their lunch break or anything else where they can save, because taking it from the worker is bringing it into your own pocket. Now take a step back with me, as Marx does, and ask yourself, what a way to set up production. What a way to organize an economic system. What you're doing is setting up in every workplace, in every store, in every office, in every factory, a conflict of interests, a battle that never stops. Marx calls it the class struggle. It's what every worker discovers wherever he, she, they are working, that there's this endless struggle to squeeze more, press down the wage, which means the employer will hire specialists, engineers, lawyers, accountants to figure out every day. Hire a new MBA graduate who might come in with a new idea of how you can squeeze. It's a conflict-ridden system. And in that conflict, the employers have the upper hand most of the time. What do I mean? Well, they take that difference, the difference between the value added by their employees and the wages they pay to those employees. That's their profit. And that's, of course, where they get the money with which to buy the tools, equipment, and raw materials. So now we know how those things which were the products of labor ended up the property of non-laborers. It's the people working today who produce the profit taken by the employer that enables them to be the capitalist in the first place. It's a self-reproducing system. Yeah, it is rigged. Of course it's rigged. You now understand how it's rigged and why it's rigged this way. Capitalists have the need to do this. They have to worry that there will be people stop buying what they produce because tastes change, because some other capitalist is able to offer a better product or a cheaper product or both. Car companies producing gas-powered cars are confronted by Tesla and electric cars. How do they survive? They have to have as much profit as possible to go and either produce electric cars themselves or come up with some new development. Capitalists are always worried. They'll be outcompeted, if you like. And so they want more profit. Sure, it's also to live luxuriously, which they do, take a lot of that profit for their own personal consumption. But they're driven by more than that. They're driven by the competitive situation that everything is always insecure. There's always some other capitalist trying to grab on to an opportunity to profit at their expense. So it's driven not only by the conflict between capitalists and workers, but by the competition among the capitalists. That's why it has this driven quality, that no matter how big it gets, it needs to get bigger. No matter how rich the employer gets, it has to get richer. It's a kind of crazy system. It's not just rigged in one way, but it's also driven in a kind of crazed manner. That's why many religions know that there's something wrong with a system in which the real almighty is the almighty dollar. The American example of capitalism being the dominant one for the last 75 years. The consequences of a Marxist understanding of production are incredible. They give you something to think about. And let me give you just a few examples. Number one, inequality. This is a system that breeds inequality. The workers are many. They're producing a profit received by a few. Employers are few. According to the U.S. Census, employers are 3% of our population. All the rest of us are not employers. Most of us are employees. So we have an arrangement in which large numbers of people are gathered together in factories, offices, and stores to produce a lot of value by our labor. We get a wage back, but a large portion of what we produce is kept by the employers, and that's 3% of the people. So yes, they become quite wealthy. They are the 3%. Or if you like, the 1%. It doesn't matter. It's a tiny percentage who become wealthy. Americans these days think about their annual salaries in terms of tens of thousands of dollars, because that's where most Americans are. But then there are some like, I don't know, Elon Musk, or Bill Gates, or Warren Buffett, or Jeffrey Bezos. They count their wealth in hundreds of billions of dollars. This is crazy. You have to go back to ancient slave societies, like the pharaohs in Egypt, when there were masses of slaves who produced enough profit in their system for their masters so that the masters could erect the pyramids as their tombs, because they had all these people that they could put to work in whatever way they thought appropriate. Bezos and Musk, they don't make pyramids. They do something similar. Space programs to see what they can find out in space. Or they decide to own 26 yachts or 50 mansions. Come on. You want to understand inequality. I just answered it. Marx did the work for us. Whatever you want to do about it, Marx explains where it comes from. And there is an implication here that's tough. The implication is, if you really don't like, don't approve, don't agree with the inequalities all around us, rich and poor countries, rich and poor states, rich and poor neighborhoods, you grew up in a country full of these extreme inequalities. Marx's message, if you don't want those, if you want a community not divided into rich and poor and all that means, all the bitterness, all the envy, all the jealousy, all the defensiveness, all the violence, then Marx's argument says you got to deal with an economic system. Because if you don't, you'll fail. And what do we know about the last 150 years of American history? We've had repeated efforts to say this inequality is not good for us. This inequality is excessive. And yet, what have we done? We've had a great society program, a war against poverty. They all fail. They all fail. And why? Because they don't dare deal with the economic system out of which this inequality emerges as its product. Marx had a fun line in Capital. He said it's true that capitalism has been productive of great wealth. The problem is it has also been productive of great poverty. And the worst of it, it reproduces the one every bit as efficiently as it reproduces the other. And that's the problem. You want to deal with poverty? You want to deal with inequality? Well, then you got to deal with capitalism as a system. If you don't, you will not solve the problem. And I leave you with that message. If you don't, you will not solve the problem. And yet we live here in the United States and in many other countries, in places where systematic study and learning from Marx is prevented, is a taboo, is denied, is repressed, which therefore blocks people from understanding that part of any solution to inequality and poverty has to be changes in your economic system, or else you're just not serious. Okay. A second example. The Marxian argument also addresses another basic question people, particularly people who have a little bit of a critical perspective, have asked. Why is capitalism so unstable? In other words, as a system, not only has it got this extreme inequality, which it cannot overcome, even having tried to do so on many occasions, why is it so unstable? And what do I mean here? Well, I'm going to rely on the research of a very important American institution, the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. They do the very useful service of charting the ups and downs of the American economy. And basically what they have found is that on average, every 4 to 7 years, capitalist economic systems crash. Yeah, they crash every 4 to 7 years. And what does it mean, this crash? Well, it means the following. Suddenly, huge numbers of people are thrown out of work. It's not because they are not doing good work. It's not because their skills have disappeared. It's not because they're too drunk to come to work. None of that. They're just as efficient and just as hardworking when the crash happens as they were 2 months, 6 months, 10 months, 2 years before. Suddenly, large numbers of businesses crash. Those workers lose their jobs. Those businesses are forever gone. What happened? Well, it's the way the system works, we're told. What? Yes, in the university, we are taught about business cycles. That's a nice word, sounds much less terrible than crash. Now, it is true that each crash is unique in some ways. They don't last the same amount of time. They don't peak and drop to their bottom in the same way. Some of the crashes are shallow and quick and short. Some of the crashes are harsh, deep, and last a long time. The Great Depression of the 1930s lasted over a decade, over 10 years, and was horrible. Unemployment at its peak was 33%, 8 or 9 times what it is right now. But we haven't been able to get out of it. The governments of capitalist countries have tried desperately to stop these cycles. And there's a simple reason why. A system begins to lose support of the people if it's producing mass unemployment and the collapse of businesses left and right. That's a time when people question the system, are angry about the system, are bitter about how it has destroyed their livelihoods, their educations, their hopes, their dreams. Young people in America are going through that right now. So the system is nervous. When it crashes, it's terribly frightened that it might crash harshly for a long time. It wants to make it short. It wants people not to think about it. It wants to distract folks. But Marxism is not in the business of saving capitalism. It doesn't like capitalism and thinks we can do better. So Marxism has said, well, let's take a look. This system is unstable. Any system that crashed every 4 to 7 years would have to have the label unstable. When I teach this in the university, I lean across the podium and I say to my students, if you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. And they laugh. And the point of Marxism is to say, you ought to laugh too. You're a member of a system. You participate in a system that threatens you with unemployment every 4 to 7 years. Let's take a look at American history. We've had 3 crashes in this century so far. In the first year, 2000, we had what we call the dot-com crash. In 2008 and 9, we had the subprime mortgage crash. And in 2020, 2021, we had the COVID-19 crash. We can put a different label on each one, but we've had 3 crashes in 23 years, right about the 4 to 7 year average, isn't it? When the crashes come, terrible suffering. Unemployed people are shown, there's lots of studies, they turn to alcohol, they turn to violence in the household, they get more physically and mentally ill. Divorces shoot up, family problems explode, people lose their home, lose their car. You all know. What kind of a system do we have that every 4 to 7 years drops this bomb? Why are there not questions as to what in the world is going on? The few economists that have dared to ask have mostly come up with the right answer, which is the crashes happen when capitalists decide that they're not going to put their wealth to production. They're not going to hire workers. They're going to wait a year or two because the conditions aren't good. The market isn't there, or the technology isn't there, or the workers are demanding too much money, or whatever the reason. It's when capitalists decide to hold back. If they don't hire workers, then those workers don't have an income. And if those workers don't have an income, they can't spend. And if they don't spend, then the goods that were produced by other capitalists can't be sold. And so they lay off their workers, and we get that snowball called a recession. And if it goes further and lasts longer, a depression. So much power is in the hands of the 3% who are employers that their decisions what to do with their wealth shape the ups and downs of the whole economy. In other words, the structure of capitalism produces the instability that everybody, including capitalists, neither want nor can do anything about. And these are signs that you need system change. Now let me conclude. It's all well and good to show that a critical approach to capitalism has much to say, much to teach us. Everything I've just gone over with you is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. It is the core of what the Marxian economics tradition has to offer. There's much more that's been done. It's a very rich tradition, as any visit to a decent library will show you. And I urge you to do that. Learn about it. It'll only make your thinking about the world sharper, clearer, more comprehensive, and basically more adequate to the crisis we are now living through, which is a crisis of capitalism yet again. It's a little different this time because the crisis of capitalism is felt more in the old places where employer-employee capitalism has existed. Western Europe, North America, and Japan. Those are the places where capitalism is in deep trouble. Younger capitalism, where the employer-employee relationship is newer and is being shaped more by the government working with the private sector rather than by the private sector pushing the government away. And I'm talking here about China, India, Brazil, and so on. They have less of a crisis. They're on the upswing. We have more of one because we are on the down. And that, too, is an application of a Marxian approach. But are there alternatives? Is there anything else? Or are we stuck with this system? Is the message really resign yourself? There's nothing better than you that you can get? Well, luckily, people in the past didn't believe that. The people in slavery fought hard, felt they could do better, and in the end, they did. And people in feudalism, those lords and serfs, there were plenty of them who were resigned, who were happy about it. But there were enough who were critical. that they could and would do better. That's how we have capitalism, because people fought to do better than slavery and to do better than feudalism. Well, what is the Marxist tradition about? It's about people who felt and who feel that we can do better than capitalism. We don't have to have a system that produces extremes of wealth and poverty. We don't have to have a system that's unstable and all the other things I don't have time to go over with you now. And what would the better system be? Well, it's kind of obvious, although Marx never spelled it out. He made a few gestures in that direction. He was a critic of capitalism. That was his project. That's what he devoted himself to. And that's what Marxism is mostly about. It's not about speculations of the future beyond those implied by the critique of capitalism. And here's that one. We don't need employers and employees. We can learn from the past of the human race. There were always, thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, 10 years ago, there were always people who didn't want to, who refused to participate in slavery, in feudalism, or in capitalism. And one of the ways they did that was to organize production in a radically different way. No master, no slave. No lord, no serf. No employer, no employee. Instead, the workplace should be organized as a democratic community. The workers together decide, one person, one vote, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the output. There don't have to be employers and employees. We are a community that can assign work tasks, divide up the product, divide up the income amongst ourselves. True, we wouldn't give a few people billions, whereas the mass majority are worried about whether they can get their kid to college or put food on the table. We wouldn't do that. That's why we don't want capitalism, because it does that. The alternative, whether you call it a worker co-op, or a collective, or a commune, or a democratic community, it's all the same gesture. We can do better than capitalism because there are alternatives. There always were alternatives. The human race has experimented with some of them. And that basic human quality of enjoying its environment, but also retaining a critical eye, that's what makes technological progress. But that can also make social progress. And that's what Marxism, in all of its better incarnations, has always been about. You can learn from this tradition. Willfully keeping away from doing that is imposing on yourself an ignorance that will not help you or anybody else. If you found what we do in these presentations interesting, please understand that part of whatever value we have or that I have comes out of having learned and trying to use the insights I got from that tradition, which are different from insights I got from other traditions, which I got. But closing yourself off from the Marxian tradition is just playing into the hands of those who don't want the system to change, who are sitting at the top, and whose greatest fear is precisely that people will understand we can and we should do better. Thank you for your attention, and we'll be back in July with the next bi-monthly installment of Global Capitalism.